The gavel hadn't even finished ringing off the brass plate on the auctioneer's desk before someone in the back row let out a sharp, loud laugh. $18,500, the auctioneer repeated, leaning forward and squinting through the hazy courtroom light at the young woman in the faded canvas jacket, like he'd misread his own ledger. Across the crowded room, no one raised a card. Nora Linwood didn't flinch. She kept her right hand steady in the air until the clerk nodded, slammed the wooden mallet down with a finality that made the front row jump, and moved on to the next parcel. Around her, heavy work boots shifted on the linoleum. A folding chair creaked under sudden weight. Somewhere behind her shoulder, a man muttered loud enough for 3 rows to hear. She just bought herself 120 acres of pure gray cemetery. Nora had $3,200 left in her checking account after signing over the cashier's check for the down payment. She had a 2008 Ford F-150 with 230,000 miles on the engine and a slipping transmission, a 3-legged hound named Rufus sleeping on an old coat in the truck bed, and 7 years of experience sweating on other people's land for other people's paychecks. She did not have a banker's backing, a family inheritance, or a single piece of advice from anyone in Oconee County that didn't sound like a warning. What she had was a quiet habit, half stubborn discipline, half obsession, of noticing things other people walked past without a second glance. Nobody in the courtroom understood why she wanted the place. Nobody asked her either. They simply watched her sign the deeds at the deputy's table and shook their heads on the way out to their trucks, already working up the story they'd hand around the stove at the feed store on Monday morning. Trash Gulch sat 8 miles outside Walhalla, tucked hard against a jagged limestone spur of the Blue Ridge Mountains that most farmers considered good for nothing but rattlesnakes and copperheads. The soil on the flat ground below the ridge was gray kaolin clay, dense, pale, and thick as wet cement in the spring, baking into a slate-hard crust by mid-July that shed rainwater like iron plate. 3 families had tried to farm it in the last 15 years. All 3 had packed their trucks in the dead of night and walked away poorer than the day they arrived. The fences sagged in long silver lines across the property, the wire rusted and slack from decades of frost heavings. The old wooden farmhouse had a roof that bowed in the middle, like an ancient workhorse's back. A rusted disc harrow sat where the last tenant had abandoned it, swallowed halfway to the axle by bindweed and wild briars. The barn door hung on one bent hinge, groaning every time the wind swept down off the mountain. And the limestone ridge itself, rocky, vertical, completely unfarmable by any conventional measure, rose up behind the house like a wall no one had ever bothered to look past. That hillside is the reason 3 families are broke, Nora. Frank Vance told her 3 days later, leaning his elbow against the roof of his truck at the gas station, like he had all afternoon to explain her mistake to her. Frank farmed 300 acres of dark river-bottom soil along the Chattooga, and his word carried weight in the county. You can't run cattle on stone. You can't put a plow into a 40-degree rock face. Whoever sold you that land sold you an expensive postcard. Nora just nodded and thanked him for his time. She'd spent 7 years working for men like Frank. You let them finish their sentences, because arguing never turned a mind that had already shut its doors. But she had walked that rocky slope 4 times before the auction, and something she saw on her last walk had lodged in her mind like a burr under a saddle. It was late April, 2 nights before the auction. An unseasonable killing frost had dropped out of the mountains, blackening the leaves on every fruit tree for 20 miles. Frank Vance had lost half his peach crop before the blossoms even set. The apple orchards down in the valley were ruined. But halfway up that steep, worthless limestone ridge on Trash Gulch, along a narrow 60-foot strip of shale running the length of the slope, the wild plum thickets were still deep green, blooming full and white, completely untouched by the freezing air that had destroyed everything around them. The county agent called it a fluke. Frank Vance called it brush. But as Nora stood at her new fence line that evening, watching the dusk settle over the ridge, she knew it was neither. What she didn't know was that the real danger wasn't the rocky slope or the bitter cold. It was a sudden, devastating event, heading straight for Oconee County, that would force her to risk her very last dollar on a gamble no one believed could work. The front porch of the old farmhouse gave a low groan under Nora's boots as she carried her first load of supplies inside. The air inside smelled of damp pine, old horsehair plaster, and decades of trapped winter dust. In the corner of the kitchen, a rusted cast iron stove sat cold, its stovepipe rusted through near the ceiling line. Outside, Rufus trotted slowly along the sagging perimeter fence, his nose pressed deep into the gray clay, sniffing the tracks of white-tailed deer that had treated the property like wilderness for years. Nora didn't start by painting the walls or fixing the porch steps. She spent her first 3 days on Trash Gulch, doing what 7 years of hired labor had taught her to do best: measuring the ground with her own hands. She walked the lower field with a soil auger she'd bought second-hand off an estate sale, driving the steel spiral deep into the pale kaolin clay every 50 paces. Just as the county records had warned, the top 8 inches were dry, compacted and choked with pale river gravel. But when she worked her way up the steep incline of the limestone spur, reaching that 60-foot ribbon where the wild plum thicket grew, the iron tip hit something completely different. Beneath a thin blanket of loose dark shale lay a layer of rich, crumbly loam, damp to the touch even after 4 days without rain. Nora knelt in the dry grass, rubbed the dark earth between her thumb and forefinger, and smelled it. It was cool, rich, and held together without clumping into a ball of clay. It smelled like deep forest floor after a midnight shower. If you've ever stood on a piece of ground everyone else told you was useless and felt in your gut that they were missing the bigger picture, you know the quiet stillness that settled over Nora in that moment. Leave a comment with the state or country you're watching from, and tell me if you've ever had to trust your own eyes when everyone around you was telling you to turn back. Nora kept her notes in a small, leather-bound pocket ledger that had belonged to her grandfather. Every evening, by the yellow light of an oil lamp, she sketched the contours of the ridge, marking the exact spots where the wild plum trees flourished and recording the ground temperature at 5 Lacazette. With a meat thermometer she'd recalibrated in boiling water. Down in Walhalla, the stories about her were already set in stone. At the Oak Street Diner, where the local farmers gathered every morning for coffee and sausage biscuits, Nora's purchase was the favorite topic of conversation. She's 25 years old and thinks she's going to beat 3 generations of bad luck with a F-150 and a pair of leather gloves, one old tobacco grower remarked to his neighbor, shaking his head. That clay down there killed the Talmadge family's savings in '98. And it took everything the Kirkbys had 5 years back. She'll burn through her savings on gas and fence wire before the first hay cutting. Silas Buck, the cattle rancher Nora had worked for over the last 3 years, stopped his truck by her gate on a Thursday morning. Silas was a fair man. He had paid Nora $2 an hour more than any other hired hand in the valley, because she never broke a fence post and could spot a sick calf before it stopped eating. He didn't laugh at her, but his face was heavy with concern as he rested his forearms on the steering wheel. "Nora," Silas said, his voice low and steady, "you worked hard for every dime in that bank account. I watched you freeze your fingers off in my calving barn for 3 winters. That ridge has been passed over by men who farmed this county for 40 years. What makes you think you're seeing something they all missed?" Nora looked out toward the gray spur rising behind the barn. "I don't know for sure yet, Mr. Buck," she said honestly. "But there's a green strip up on that rock that stayed alive while your lower pasture froze solid 3 weeks ago. Something's happening up there that isn't happening anywhere else." Silas looked at her for a long moment, searching her face for foolishness or pride. He found neither. Only the same quiet, unyielding focus she'd shown when fixing his irrigation lines in mid-July. "In farming," he said softly, "faith and stubborn foolishness look exactly the same right up until the harvest comes in. I just hope you left yourself enough of a cushion if the winter catches you flat." Even her old crewmates on Silas's ranch seemed to treat her with a strange distance now, as if her decision to buy Trash Gulch was a kind of betrayal or a sudden loss of mind. A boy named Luke, who had started the same month she did, pulled up alongside her at the feed store on Saturday to drop off 2 rolls of barbed wire she'd bought. "You're throwing away 6 years of sweat on a scrap of rock nobody wanted, Nora," Luke told her, leaning against his tailgate. He didn't say it meanly. He said it with the quiet sadness of someone watching a friend make a mistake they couldn't stop. "You could've leased 50 good acres down by the creek." Nora let the words settle. She knew that the loudest doubts usually came from people who cared what happened to you, even if they couldn't see what you saw. By the second week of May, Nora took her first real gamble. She spent $1,100, more than a third of her remaining savings, on a rented brush hog and a small shipment of heirloom snow pear saplings, a hardy variety known for deep rooting and cold resistance. For 5 straight days, from dawn until her muscles burned, she cleared thickets of thorn briar and wild locust along that narrow 60-foot strip on the ridge, hauling away tons of loose rock by hand to prepare her first test plot. Her hands were blistered, her back throbbed with every breath, but as the last sapling was staked into the rich shale soil, she felt a quiet surge of hope. She had built a sanctuary against the cold. What she didn't know was that nature was about to test her resolve with a sudden, violent vengeance. A brutal June hailstorm was brewing in the mountains, heading straight for her newly planted ridge. Every morning at 4:30 a.m., long before the first pale ribbon of dawn touched the jagged ridge of the Blue Ridge Mountains, Nora was already out in the field. The valley air at that hour was heavy and cold enough to turn her breath to white steam. While the rest of Oconee County slept, she walked the steep 40-degree slope with a headlamp strapped over her wool cap, a pocket notebook in her canvas coat, and a brass soil thermometer in her hand. Her routine was governed by an absolute unforgiving discipline. She tested the soil pH at 20-foot intervals along the rocky slope. She drove steel fence posts into the shale with a 20-pound sledgehammer until her shoulders burned and her palms bled through her leather gloves. She hand-carried gallons of water up the rock face, using 2 rusted 5-gallon buckets balanced across a wooden yoke. By the first week of June, Nora made her biggest financial move. She sank $2,100, nearly all of her remaining capital, into 300 certified bare-root heirloom snow pear saplings. They were an old, deep-rooting strain, recommended by no modern agricultural extension office. But her testing told her they were the only trees tough enough to handle the shale. For 9 straight days, she worked 18-hour shifts, digging deep trench lines into the narrow 60-foot warm strip, wrapping every single sapling root in protective wire netting to keep out the voles, and packing them firmly into the dark shale earth. By June 14th, all 300 saplings stood in neat straight rows along the high slope, their young green leaves catching the morning sun. Nora stood at the bottom of the ridge, wiped the sweat and red clay from her forehead with her sleeve, and allowed herself her very first moment of quiet pride. That pride lasted less than 48 hours. On the afternoon of June 16th, the sky behind the mountain spur turned an unnatural, bruised shade of greenish black. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in less than 20 minutes. There was no thunder, no gentle warning breeze. Only a sudden, deafening roar that sounded like a freight train, barreling directly over the ridge. It wasn't just rain. It was a localized violent mountain storm, carrying wind-driven hail the size of walnuts, followed by a flash-freezing front that dropped out of the high pass. For 11 agonizing minutes, frozen ice balls pounded the eastern slope of Trash Gulch with merciless force. Nora ran toward the orchard with a tarp, but the wind tore it from her grip, slamming her sideways into the rocks. She could only watch from the bed of her truck as the ice hammered her slope. When the storm finally passed as abruptly as it had arrived, the silence that followed was suffocating. Nora climbed the slope, her boots slipping on the thick layer of melting ice and churned gray mud. The damage was total. All 300 of her newly planted saplings had been shredded to bare, splintered sticks. The young leaves were stripped, crushed into green paste in the mud. The delicate bark had been peeled back by the force of the ice, exposing the white, vulnerable wood beneath. 3 weeks of backbreaking, 18-hour days, and $2,100 of her life savings had been erased in 660 seconds. Nora sank to her knees in the freezing, waterlogged mud right in the middle of the ruined row. Her hands, cut and raw from trying to straighten the battered wire cages, began to shake. The cold mud soaked through her denim jeans, freezing her skin, but she couldn't feel it. The sheer weight of the loss pressed down on her chest until she couldn't catch a breath. She rested her forehead against the icy tailgate of a fence trailer, closed her eyes and let herself cry. She didn't sob softly. She let out a jagged, silent tear that burned her eyes, her shoulders shaking violently in the cold air. But even in her grief, Nora stayed in control of her mind. She counted every single breath in her head. 1 second, 2 seconds, 60 seconds. She allowed herself to feel the absolute crushing weight of failure, but she put a strict clock on it. She cried for exactly 4 minutes, 240 seconds. When her mental clock hit 4 minutes, Nora squeezed her eyes shut, wiped her muddy sleeve across her face, taking off a layer of wet earth, and took one long, ragged breath. She opened her eyes, reached down into the cold mud, picked up her fallen shovel, and stood back up. 2 hours later, as the sun began to set, a white Dodge Ram belonging to Frank Vance slowed down along the county road near her fence line. The truck stopped for a long 30 seconds. Frank didn't get out. He didn't offer a hand. He just sat behind the glass, looked up at the shredded sticks on the hillside, shook his head in slow, predictable disappointment, and drove away. Nora didn't watch him leave. She was already kneeling by the first tree, examining the root collars to see which ones still had living tissue beneath the bark. The next morning, instead of calling a real estate agent to put the land back on the market, Nora drove her old Ford into Walhalla and pulled up to a small whitewashed house on Oak Street. Inside lived Idelle Marsh, an 81-year-old woman who had grown up on Parcel 4B 70 years ago, long before the Talmadges or Kirbys had ever set foot on the ground. Idelle was sharp, her eyes clear as creek water behind her glasses. When Nora laid out her hand-drawn map of the ridge and explained what had happened to the trees, the old woman didn't laugh. She leaned back in her porch chair and nodded slowly. "My daddy used to call that slope the warm belt, child," Idelle said, her voice like dry leaves rustling. "Everyone thinks cold air just sits on a mountain. It don't. Heavy freezing air is heavy like cold water. It rolls down off that high peak at night and pools right in that low, flat clay field where 3 families tried to plant corn. That flat ground is a death trap. But that band on the ridge, it's just high enough that the heavy cold air rolls right over it and drops to the bottom. My daddy grew the sweetest late-season peaches in this county on that very shale. Why did they stop?" Nora asked quietly. "Because when the Talmadges bought it, they brought in big dozers," Idelle replied, spitting over the porch rail. "They cleared the whole slope, tore up the natural stone terraces, and tried to plow it flat like Iowa cornland. They killed the natural draft. Once you fight the shape of the land wins every time. You don't plow that ridge, girl. You plant with the rock, not against it." Nora sat on Idelle's porch for an hour, absorbing every detail. The pieces of the puzzle finally locked together in her head with absolute clarity. The wild plum thickets, the thermal air currents, the shale drainage, the mistake of the previous owners. It wasn't luck. And it wasn't a fluke. It was pure physics and history that everyone else had been too impatient to read. Nora returned to Trash Gulch with exactly $800 left to her name, her absolute bottom line. If this next move failed, she wouldn't have enough money for truck gas, let alone mortgage payments. Instead of buying new trees, she used her remaining money to order specialized graftwood of the ancient snow pear strain and 300 bare root hardy rootstocks. Working by the light of a hanging lantern late into the night, she hand-grafted every single stem herself, wrapping the joints in wax and twine. She dug deeper terraces into the shale slope, building small semicircular stone retainers around each plant using the very rocks everyone said made the land worthless. By late July, the grafted roots began to take. Tiny, vibrant green buds began to burst through the sealed wax joints along the warm strip. Nora stood at the edge of the ridge at 5 km, holding her thermometer. The air in the flat clay field below was a freezing 32 degrees, but up on her narrow shale terrace, the gauge read 41 degrees. Her map was working, her system was holding. But as late August approached, an unprecedented, record-breaking autumn freeze warning was issued for the entire Blue Ridge Basin. A killing frost massive enough to destroy every orchard in South Carolina, and the ultimate test of whether Nora's final $800 had been spent on a miracle or a grave. By the first week of October, the mountain air turned crisp and thin, smelling of cured hay and pine needles. The grafted snow pear rootstocks along Nora's narrow shale terrace had put on sturdy dark green growth, their main stems hardening into pale brown wood. Down on the flat gray kaolin clay field below the ridge, Nora had left the ground untouched, allowing wild goldenrod and native asters to reclaim the soil. 3 previous families had tried and failed to break with heavy steel plows. Then came the night of October 12th. Weather warnings broadcast over the county radio station had predicted a mild autumn frost, but a massive unexpected polar air mass broke out of the high peaks of the Blue Ridge late that evening, plunging the valley into an unprecedented freeze 2 full weeks early. By the ground temperature across Oconee County plummeted to 22 degrees Fahrenheit, A brutal, dry cold that caught every commercial grower in the region completely unprepared. Across the county, the destruction was swift and total. Down along the Chattooga River, Frank Vance woke at dawn to find his remaining late-season peach crop, frozen solid on the branches, turned to brown mush, before the sun could even clear the trees. Silas Buck's lower pasture ponds froze over, with a quarter-inch layer of black ice, killing off the late clover his cattle relied on for autumn grazing. The commercial apple growers near Tamassie lost tens of thousands of dollars in unharvested fruit in less than 6 hours. Nora didn't sleep that night. At 4:30 am, wrapped in 2 wool coats, with her headlamp cutting through the pitch-black mist, she walked the perimeter of Trash Gulch with Rufus trotting beside her. Her brass thermometer clutched tight in her gloved hand. As she stepped onto the low, flat clay field where the old farmhouse sat, the cold hit her like a wet wall. Her breath froze into thick clouds, and the wild grass beneath her boots crunched like dry glass. The gauge read 21 degrees. The flat ground was a frozen sink, trapping every cubic foot of dense, heavy cold air that rolled off the peaks. Step by step, Nora began climbing the steep 40-degree incline of the limestone spur. As her boots crossed the threshold of the 60-foot shale strip, 30 feet above the valley floor, the air shifted dramatically. The biting chill abruptly lifted. The heavy mist vanished, placed by a clear, dry stillness. Nora held up her thermometer and waited for the red mercury line to settle. 39 degrees. The physics of the slope had held perfectly, just as old Adele Marsh had described. The heavy, freezing air generated on the high mountain peaks plummeted straight down the mountain wall, but instead of settling on the elevated shale ledge, it rolled right over the warm strip like water cascading over a stone dam, plunging straight down into the flat clay basin below. Every single one of Nora's 300 grafted snow pear saplings stood green, vibrant, and untouched by the killing frost. Their leaves were crisp, their wax-grafted buds tight and secure, insulated by the thermal draft rising off the sun-warmed limestone face behind them. Standing on the ridge as the sun broke over the mountaintops, painting the frost-covered valley below in brilliant shades of silver and gold, Nora finally understood the complete truth of the land she had bought. It wasn't 120 acres of worthless, rocky ground with one useless hillside attached. It was the exact opposite. The flat, farmable clay soil below, the land every previous owner had fought and spent their life savings trying to plow, was the true liability, a natural death trap cursed by its own low elevation. And the steep, rocky slope everyone had written off as worthless stone was, and always had been, the finest fruit-growing ground in the entire county, sitting there unused for decades, because 3 generations of men had judged it by what it looked like, instead of how the air behaved. By midday, word of what had happened on Trash Gulch began to ripple through the county. Silas Buck was the first to drive out. He pulled his heavy diesel truck onto the shoulder of the county road, stepped out into the chill wind, and stood silently by the fence line for 10 minutes. He didn't say a word. He just adjusted his hat, looked up at the vibrant green ribbon running along the dark gray stone spur while every field around it lay white and frozen, and nodded once to himself before driving away. On Sunday afternoon, Luke, her former crewmate from Silas's farm, drove past in his farm truck. He slowed down to a crawl, leaning his head out the window to stare up at the terraced shale slope. He pulled over near her gate, walked over to where Nora was repairing an old wooden gatepost, and stood with his hands jammed deep into his coat pockets. He looked up at the healthy green saplings, then down at his own mud-caked work boots, shaking his head in quiet disbelief. "I don't know how you saw it, Nora," Luke said softly, running a callous thumb along the smooth wooden grain of her fence post. "Everyone in town said you were crazy. I told people you were crazy." "People look at the surface, Luke," Nora said, her voice calm and steady as she set her hammer down. "They see rock, and they think stone. They don't wait around long enough to ask why the frost doesn't stick." Luke let out a low whistle, looked up at the slope one last time, and turned back toward his truck. "Guess I owe you a diner lunch next time you're in town," he said quietly, which was as close as a valley farmhand would ever come to admitting he had been completely wrong. By late afternoon, as the shadows of the Blue Ridge began to lengthen across the valley, a familiar white Dodge Ram slowed down as it approached Parcel 4B. The truck didn't pass by this time. It turned onto the gravel pull-off near Nora's mailbox and came to a complete stop. The driver's side door creaked open, and Frank Vance stepped out into the cold autumn dust, holding a heavy iron post-hole digger he had borrowed from Silas 2 months prior. He didn't look at Nora right away. He stood by her fence line, his eyes fixed on the green mountain slope that had just survived the worst early freeze in 30 years, while his own river-bottom peaches lay ruined in the mud. Frank walked slowly toward the gate, the heavy iron digger resting across his shoulder. He stopped 10 feet from where Nora stood, turning the iron tool over in his calloused hands like he needed something solid to hold on to. "I've farmed 300 acres along the Chattooga for 31 years, Nora," Frank said, his voice lower and rougher than usual. He stared up at the green rose resting on the shale slope, the white blossoms from her grafted stock glistening in the late afternoon light like snow that had decided to stay. "I drove past this ridge 1,000 times. Never once thought to ask why those wild plums never froze." "Neither did anyone else, Mr. Vance," Nora replied gently. Her tone held no victory, no arrogance, just the simple, unvarnished truth, the same way Silas Buck had once spoken to her. Frank nodded slowly, looking down at the gray soil beneath his boots. "I was wrong about you," he said. The words came out hard, costing him every ounce of pride he had built over 3 decades in Oconee County. "And I was wrong about this ground." He set the post-hole digger neatly against her barn wall, tipped his hat once, and walked back to his truck without another word. Silas Buck didn't need to say anything at all. He just stood by the fence line as dusk settled, looking at the orchard, his quiet nod, telling Nora everything she would ever need to know. By the following spring, Parcel 4B didn't look like the place people had mocked at the auction house. The old farmhouse had a solid new roof, paid for in cash from her first specialty harvest of snow pears that had sold out at the regional market in less than 2 hours. The warm strip now held 400 young trees in staggered, stone-retained rows, thriving on a hillside where everyone said nothing could grow. Nora had left the flat, low-clay field to pasture and wild mountain flowers, done fighting a war against the land itself. Rufus had a warm, dry porch to sleep on, and the long silver fences along the road finally stood straight and true. That evening, sitting alone on the front steps with a mug of warm tea, while Rufus rested his heavy chin on her boot, Nora looked out over the valley. She remembered the long, freezing winters spent in other men's barns, fixing fences that would never belong to her, harvesting crops she would never own a share of, always the hired help, never the steward. She remembered being told, gently and bitterly, that a 25-year-old girl with no capital should be grateful for steady wages and stop reaching for things beyond her reach. She looked up at 400 trees, standing strong on a mountain spur, the whole county had written off as dead stone, and she didn't feel triumphant. She felt a quiet, profound peace that was worth every blistered hand, every icy morning, and every dollar of doubt. The lesson was never that she was smarter than the farmers who had come before her. She wasn't. The lesson was that land, like human beings, rarely reveals its whole truth on the surface. Most people looked at Trash Gulch and saw a slope too steep to plant and a flat field too poor to farm, and they stopped looking right there. Nora had simply been willing to stay a little longer, look a little deeper, and ask why the frost refused to touch the stone. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who's been told what they have isn't worth the trouble. Drop your city in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever checked something everyone else had already written off, I want to hear what you found. Every comment gets read. Everyone.